As a soldier, you are protecting your city. You've heard the tales. Whole populations were eliminated. Blood rivers. Monuments constructed with human remains. He's at your gates now. Your leader has a decision to make. Give yourself up. Mercy is promised by the conqueror. On his honor, he swears that you won't lose a single drop of blood. The gates are opened by you. You put your weapons down. At that point, you become aware of the awful error you did. Because this monster, this man, fulfills his commitments. Not in the manner you had imagined, though. You and thousands of your fellow soldiers will be herded into enormous holes in a matter of hours, not to be killed. No, that would be too fast. They're burying you alive. You scream, drowning in the dark as dirt washes over your face. In a technical sense, the conqueror fulfilled his promise. There was not a single drop of blood. This did in fact occur. The individual who carried it out didn't end there. He would go on to kill 17 million people, construct towers out of severed heads, and carry out actions so horrifying that even seasoned medieval chroniclers were unable to complete recording them without getting sick. Go ahead and subscribe if you're interested in the darkest periods of history that are rarely discussed. We constantly delve into this material. And really, give it a like because things are going to become a lot worse from here on out. You must hear what transpired with the fifth city, I assure you. It's completely different. His name was Tamerlane, and the damage he caused to 5 cities made all previous historical conquerors seem like amateurs. This is the tale of deliberate brutality at its most extreme. I must caution you that what you are about to hear will stick with you. You must comprehend Tamerlane's true identity before we go into the nightmare. Because this wasn't a mindless savage brandishing a sword. This man was a gifted military strategist, a supporter of the arts, and a multilingual poet, which somehow heightens the horror of what he accomplished. Born in what is now Uzbekistan in 1336, Timur, later known as Tamerlane, which means Timur the Lame, rose from lowly aristocracy to become one of history's most successful conquerors after suffering a limp from a war injury. Rebuilding the Mongol Empire was his life's work, and he claimed ancestry from Genghis Khan. However, Tamerlane transformed dread into an art form, whereas Genghis Khan employed it as a tool. This is what sets him apart from other conquerors. Throughout history, the majority of military leaders have desired to control the territories they have conquered. They required the infrastructure to be operational, the cities to remain intact, and the people to be able to pay taxes. He didn't care, Tamerlane. It wasn't enough to submit. If a city rebelled after surrendering or, worse, resisted him, he did more than simply discipline them. He destroyed them. And he did it with such methodical, merciless creativity that his reputation turned into his most powerful tool. He intended for cities to immediately surrender after learning what had happened to those who disobeyed him. His most powerful weapon was fear, which he nourished with torrents of blood. The extent of his devastation is nearly unfathomable. That Tamerlane's wars may have killed 17 million people in just 35 years of conquest, from 1370 to 1405. To put that in perspective, there were only roughly 365 million people on the planet at the time. This implies that he may have killed almost 5% of the world's population. Consider that. It's possible that 1 in every 20 people who lived during his lifetime perished as a result of him. The precise figures are now disputed by historians. Medieval body counts are what they always do. However, even if we cut that number in half, the extent of mass death would still be unimaginable. And unlike plagues or natural disasters, this was intentional, meticulous, and intimate. How did he accomplish it, then? What particular atrocities caused entire civilizations to shudder when his name was mentioned? Let's investigate. And now I'm cautioning you. These 5 acts will become increasingly unsettling. Our exploration of Tamerlane's techniques starts in the city of Sivas, which is situated in what is now central Turkey. Around the year 1400, the Ottoman Empire controlled Casus at this time, and a garrison of soldiers, mostly Armenian Christians, defended it, giving them every cause to be afraid of what was ahead. By 1400, Tamerlane was well known throughout the world. Every soldier protecting Casus was familiar with the tales. They had heard about the unimaginable atrocities meted out to those who rebelled, the cities that had been destroyed, and the people who had been slaughtered. Therefore, the defenders of seas had little choice as Tamerlane's enormous army loomed on the horizon. Either fight and perish or give up and possibly perish. The garrison resisted the siege for as long as they could. However, they were outmatched, outnumbered, and losing hope. At that point, Tamerlane, always the master of psychology, made them an offer that looked too good to be true. He informed the defenders, "I solemnly assure you that if you surrender immediately, there won't be any blood spilt." That it was a legally binding oath taken in front of witnesses. In medieval combat, it was the kind of promise that held significance. Such pledges were frequently observed to be upheld by commanders. It was almost like a code. The garrison argued. It was a trap, according to some. They had no chance of winning anyhow, others pointed out. There was a chance of survival, at least in this manner. Desperation ultimately prevailed. Between 3,000 and 4,000 Armenian soldiers surrendered by putting down their guns as the gates of seas opened. This is where Tamerlane's technical and terrifying genius came to the fore. The surrendered garrison was promptly captured by his soldiers. At first, the Armenians were undoubtedly perplexed. They were meant to be spared, right? After that, they were marched outside the city walls, where Tamerlane's soldiers had been hard at work excavating. Not really graves, but something far bigger. Enormous, wide, and deep ditches. Then it became evident that Tamerlane had fulfilled his pledge. He would not use swords, spears, or arrows, thus not a single drop of blood would be spilt. He intended to bury them alive. Try to picture the terror of the situation. You've given up. You've trusted in an oath, giving up your single line of defense. As you realize what's going to happen, you find yourself staring into a pit. It's likely that some of the soldiers attempted to flee. Others pleaded. Some engaged in hand-to-hand combat. It was irrelevant. What transpired next is brutally detailed in the contemporary accounts. Prisoners were pushed to the trenches' margins in groups. They were then forced inside. The soil arrived after being shoved in alive rather than dead first. Initially, there were shovels, then cartloads, and finally, screaming men were hit by rivers of soil. The weight of the bodies that fell on top of them crushed the ones at the bottom. The people in higher positions had to watch as the dirt rose, covering their faces, chests, and legs. Suffocation claimed the lives of some within minutes. Others may have spent hours in the dark, trapped in air pockets, slowly running out of oxygen as they felt the weight of corpses and the earth pushing down on them. This is how all 3,000 to 4,000 troops perished. Furthermore, Tamerlane could honestly state in front of everyone that he had fulfilled his promise. There was not a single drop of blood spilt. However, the deed itself wasn't the only thing that was truly wonderful, if we can call something so awful brilliant. It was in the message it conveyed. This had nothing to do with murdering Sivas's warriors. It was about delivering a message that would ignite in every city, kingdom, and stronghold that stood in his way. This was the message. Giving up is meaningless. Mercy is a myth. Word games are promises. Additionally, Tamerlane is constantly thinking 3 steps ahead. Sivas's story quickly circulated. All cities had to recalculate all of a sudden. Given that you would at least die with a sword in your hand rather than dirt in your lungs, perhaps fighting to the death was the best course of action. Or perhaps the only option was to submit right away. Because if you made Tamerlane work for it, you never knew what he might do. Tamerlane was terrified because of this. He was more than a conqueror. He was a psychological architect who created fearful mental systems. Casus was only his first act too. If you thought it was wrong to bury 4,000 men alive, you won't believe what he did to cities that truly rebelled against him. What Tamerlane did to the city of Urgench was quite different from what Cass taught us about deceptive promises. This was about creating a place where everyone disappeared off the planet as if they had never been there. One of Central Asia's treasures was Urgench. It was the capital of the Khwarezmian area and situated along the Silk Road trade routes in what is now Turkmenistan. The city was rich, cultured, and full with mosques, libraries, busy marketplaces, and exquisite residences. By all accounts, it was a place worth dominating. However, Urgench made a disastrous error. It rebelled. Now, in medieval empires, uprisings were commonplace. A conqueror would typically arrive, Put an end to the uprising, put the leaders to death, perhaps employ some strategic terror to make a point, and then return to collecting taxes because your empire depends on those towns operating. Not Tamerlane. He did not see rebellion as a political issue that needed to be resolved. It was a personal slight that called for complete revenge. When Urgench tried to challenge his authority in 1388, Tamerlane came back with his army. This was not going to be a siege in the conventional sense. This was meant to be an execution of the city itself, not of individuals. His army encircled. The attack started because it was urgent. Despite their valiant efforts, the defenders were up against one of the most potent military machines in history. Centuries-old city walls were breached. The real nightmare then started. Tamerlane gave precise, meticulous instructions. Kill everyone first. And by everyone I mean it. Men, women, kids, senior citizens, wealthy, and impoverished. It was irrelevant. This has nothing to do with punishing commanders or getting rid of soldiers. This was the complete eradication of the inhabitants. The streets were so flooded with blood that it created streams, according to contemporary chroniclers. However, Tamerlane was not completed because a city can be rebuilt as long as the buildings are still there. It can be repopulated. It might come back in a generation or two. Tamerlane was unable to permit that. He then issued his next directive: destroy every structure, including mosques, and level everything. And keep in mind that these mosques belonged to Muslims. Furthermore, Tamerlane was a Muslim. Therefore, this was not even the eradication of religion. This was total destruction. Every house, every store, every wall, every well, every library with its priceless texts. For weeks, his warriors tore down important stones one by one. Structures that had taken years to build were reduced to rubble. Archaeologists today struggle to even determine the whereabouts of some areas of the city due to the methodical destruction. This is where it becomes much more unsettling, where Tamerlane's actions become nearly ceremonial instead of just military ruthlessness. Numerous historical accounts state that Tamerlane gave his warriors a strange order after the city was reduced to rubble. Plant barley over the debris after plowing it. Consider the symbolic meaning of something. You cultivate barley on farmland, fields, and vacant ground. Tamerlane was making a statement by ordering barley to be sown over Urgench. This isn't a city anymore. This isn't even deserving of the term ruins. Now this is farmland. This location was not made. Some historians disagree as to whether the planting of barley truly took place or if chroniclers embellished it to highlight the extent of the devastation. To be honest, though, it doesn't matter because everyone understood the message regardless of whether it was true literally or figuratively. Urgench had vanished. Not taken, not occupied, not vanished. This is where it becomes truly scary. It was successful. Urgench never made a full recovery. Eventually, the location was abandoned. Miles away, a new city bearing the same name was constructed, but it wasn't the same location. With its centuries-old history, culture, and people, the initial urgency ceased. To be alive. Tamerlane had accomplished something that most conquerors only discuss. He had truly destroyed a city. But that poses a question. What transpired when a city had the wisdom to give up? Right away? What if they showed no resistance at all? Would Tamerlane be forgiving? Isfahan, a Persian city, was going to learn. And the response they received was one of the most terrifying incidents in medieval history. One was Isfahan, of the major Persian towns of the Middle Ages, a hub for Islamic art, science, and scholarship. In 1387, as Tamerlane's army drew near, the city's authorities took what appeared to be the right decision. They gave up right away. No siege, no resistance. They unlocked the gates, downed their guns, and surrendered. Amazingly, Tamerlane was merciful. He did not slaughter the populace. He established his own garrison in the city, administration, and levied a tax on the populace to fund his military expeditions. It was typical procedure for the occupation. Isfahan had made the correct decision. They were going to make it. Living under Tamerlane's dominion was tolerable for a few weeks. Even if there were new levies to pay and foreign soldiers on the streets, at least everyone was still alive. Markets remained open, children continued to play, and buildings remained intact. But then the inhabitants of Isfahan made a tragic miscalculation. They became rebellious after becoming enraged over the taxes. It most likely began modestly, with complaints about the occupation and discontent in the marketplaces, but it grew more intense. Attacks on Tamerlane's tax collectors started. They then pursued his warriors. The people of Isfahan slaughtered the garrison in a well-planned rebellion. Tamerlane had departed. When word got to Tamerlane, people who knew him instantly understood. Its death sentence had just been signed by Isfahan, because this is the psychological aspect of Tamerlane. He would respect it in a perverse way if you fought him right away. You would be destroyed by him, but that was to be expected. Being shown mercy and then having that mercy returned to him was something he could not bear. That was private. Tamerlane did not return to retake Isfahan. He came to set a precedent that would reverberate throughout history. His directives to his army were precise and terrifying. In addition to the horrific general killing he ordered, he instituted a quota system that transformed his soldiers into hunting groups. Every military unit was required to bring back a certain quantity of severed heads. Like a wave of death, the army surged across Isfahan. Soldiers dragged men, women, and children into the streets by going door to door. There was no discrimination in the quota. Days passed and the killings continued. The streets turned into blood rivers. It must have been really loud to hear the screaming. According to modern sources, 200,000 people died. Contemporary historians believe that figure is exaggerated and propose that a figure of about 70,000 is more realistic. Here's the problem, though. Does the difference between 70,000 and 200,000 really matter? These figures represent inexplicable mass killings. Even death on that scale is beyond the capacity of the human brain. However, the murder was only the start of Isfahan's horror. For all those chopped skulls, Tamerlane had ideas. He gave the order for his troops to gather them. Every one of them. The odor was intolerable, flies were buzzing, and tens of thousands of human heads were stacked up in the streets. After that, he issued an order that still seems unattainable. Use them to construct towers. His men built human skull pyramids. Take a moment to consider that. Memorials from the dead, not monuments to the dead. Humans are reduced to building blocks. An eyewitness chronicler who had witnessed a great deal of medieval combat attempted to tally them. Before he was literally unable to continue, he documented 28 of these skyscrapers. According to the chronicler, there were about 1,500 skulls in each tower, but he was too sick to continue counting. He was overcome by the sight, the smell, and the pure terror of it. We're still talking about towers of human skulls standing throughout a major city. Even if we assume some exaggeration in the sources, medieval chroniclers did love to embellish figures for dramatic effect. There are several skyscrapers, each of which stands for thousands of people who were living only a few days before. These weren't concealed. They were purposefully positioned in public areas near the city gates in the principal squares. They were intended to be seen. Everyone who entered Isfahan, every passenger who passed through, and every Silk Road merchant eager to see what would happen if they disobeyed Tamerlane. And it was successful. The Isfahan skull towers became fabled. They stood as a continual reminder of Tamerlane's retaliation for years, some reports claim decades, while gradually degrading. Stories about them proliferated around the world. Children would learn about the towers from their parents. They would be described with terror by merchants. When discussing whether to resist or surrender, military leaders would make reference to them. Isfahan had wagered that after they had given up, they might rebel. That Tamerlane was either too busy or too far away to reply. They were mistaken. Furthermore, not just those who took part in the uprising bore the price. The entire populace paid for it to be turned into architectural cautions to never, ever cross Tamerlane again. We're far from done, though, if you believe that towering skulls symbolize the pinnacle of Tamerlane's cruelty. Because in contrast to what he did to Delhi, Isfahan appears to be nearly controlled. The majority of Persia and Central Asia had been subjugated by Tamerlane by 1398. He was old by medieval standards in his 60s. However, his desire to conquer had not faded at all. His eyes now shifted southward, towards India's fabled wealth. At the time, northern India was governed by the Delhi Sultanate. It was powerful, rich, and, in Tamerlane's opinion, far too soft. The ostensible rationale for his invasion was that the Muslim sultans of Delhi were not treating their Hindu people with adequate severity. Never mind that there were many non-Muslims in Tamerlane's own realm, whom he taxed but did not routinely persecute. Dressed up in holy rhetoric, this was about conquest and wealth. Tamerlane started his march through northern India after assembling a sizable army of more than 90,000 troops. I also need you to comprehend something. With troops gathering on battlefields, this was not a tidy military war. It was a rolling catastrophe. Tamerlane's army pillaged everything as they advanced across the Indian countryside. Crops were burned, villages were razed, and everyone who resisted was put to death. Those who did not resist were captured and sold as slaves. The soldiers quickly had a serious issue since they were so successful at this methodical looting. There are too many inmates. According to historical reports, by the time Tamerlane's army reached Delhi, they had taken some 100,000 Hindu prisoners. Take a moment to consider the logistics of that. That is 100,000 individuals who require to be fed, protected, and prevented from fleeing. The army was accompanied by a whole city's worth of prisoners. Tamerlane sensed a tactical weakness in this circumstance. He was roughly to engage in the campaign's pivotal combat against the Sultan's troops. The last thing he wanted was for 100,000 prisoners to perhaps mutiny in the heat of the battle behind his lines. He therefore chose a choice that perfectly captures his utterly heartless, cold-blooded savagery. Take them all out. An estimated 100,000 inmates were ordered to be executed by Tamerlane on a single day. It was a methodical mass execution, not during combat or when people were resisting. According to the chroniclers, his camp turned into an abattoir where soldiers would butcher unarmed civilians for hours on end. The blood soaked the ground till it became mud. Make an effort to comprehend that. 100,000 individuals. In most wars, that is more than dying. And all of this occurred in a single day before to the start of the actual conflict. Tamerlane then engaged the Sultan's army outside Delhi on December 17, 1398. And this is when we witness both his tactical brilliance and his savagery. Because 120 war elephants were the Sultan's secret weapon. They weren't merely elephants. They possessed poison swords fastened to their tusks and were encased in chainmail armor. They were intended to destroy enemy formations and wreak complete havoc, making them the medieval equivalent of tanks. The Sultan was sure that these elephants would prevail. However, Tamerlane had completed his intelligence task. He had a plan that seems very crazy but seems to have worked, and he was aware of the elephants. Tamerlane filled his luggage camels with hay and dried grass, according to several historical accounts. The Sultan then ordered his troops to set the camels on fire and drive them directly towards the elephants as they charged. Consider yourself a battle-trained war elephant. Suddenly, dozens of blazing, screaming camels are charging at you. The elephants became frightened. Hundreds of Sultan soldiers were trampled as they turned and charged back through their own army. Delhi's defenders fell apart as the conflict descended into chaos. The city had no defense. The 5 days of planned destruction that ensued make everything we've talked about thus far seem virtually insignificant. This was not anger. This was not retaliation. This was deliberate, calculated devastation. In well-organized units, Tamerlane warriors advanced through Delhi. They targeted every neighborhood. People were murdered in their houses, on the streets, even in mosques where they had taken refuge. Blood flowed through the streets like rivers, according to the chroniclers. The sun was obscured by the dense smoke from burning structures. The looting was equally methodical. All the valuables were taken. Spices, silk, gold, and gems. Artists were sent as slaves to labor in the capital of Tamil Nadu. For the slave markets, attractive young men and women were abducted. They set fire to the libraries. There was vandalism to the monuments. Something that sounds almost apocalyptic is described in the modern chronicles. According to one chronicler, Delhi had to be entirely abandoned due to the overpowering stink of decaying bodies. The survivors ran away into the countryside. One of the major medieval capitals, The city was reduced to a ghost town of rubble and corpses. However, Tamerlane had not finished his argument. Do you recall the 120 terrified battle elephants? They were meant to be the Sultan's most powerful weapon. 90 of them were taken by Tamerlane. And in a last act of supremacy that encapsulates his mentality, they weren't killed by him. He used them. He made the elephants, emblems of Indian might and grandeur, carry stones all the way back to Samarkand, his capital. They would be utilized to construct a mosque there. Delhi's powerful combat elephants were reduced to beasts of burden, constructing monuments to the glories of Tamerlane. It was a combination of pragmatism and embarrassment, the ideal Tamerlane gesture. Delhi was so completely destroyed that it took more than a century for the city to rebuild. 100 years. Consider that. Before the city was completely rebuilt, children born on the day Tamerlane fled Delhi would pass away from old age. However, Tamerlane still had one more city to destroy, one more horrific deed that would solidify his reputation as possibly the most ruthlessly inventive conqueror in human history. This time, he intended to blend all of his earlier techniques into a single, terrifying masterpiece. The fabled city of Baghdad. It had been the epicenter of Islamic civilization for 5 centuries, a hub of knowledge, science, art, and culture. It had fallen from its heyday by 1401. However, it remained a wealthy and historically significant city. In fact, Tamerlane had already taken control of Baghdad and the city had surrendered. However, the old king of Baghdad was able to reclaim it while he was away campaigning elsewhere. You can imagine Tamerlane's response when he learnt the news. This went beyond simple rebellion. This city had submitted to him, acknowledged his authority, and then changed allegiance as soon as he turned his back. With a desire for vengeance, he went back to Baghdad. He had also refined his techniques for terror by this point. His men broke through the walls after a 40-day siege. Tamerlane then issued an order that led to one of the most horrific killings in history. He carried out what we observed at Isfahan, but on a much bigger, more organized scale. Each of the tens of thousands of soldiers in his army received a quotation that included at least 2 decapitated heads. At least 2, not just 1. Consider the psychological effects of that order. Massacre becomes a contest as a result. It puts pressure on every soldier to kill more than 1 person and prove it. Because you will be punished by your commander if you fail to fulfill your quota. Imagine what Tamerlane did to his own troops who let him down, considering what he did to his adversaries. Like locusts, Tamerlane's troops dispersed around Baghdad. They hunted people by going from house to house and street to street. Additionally, they were unable to be choosy due to the quota system. They couldn't simply murder rebels or fighters. They were in urgent need of heads, multiple. Estimates of the death toll range greatly, from 20,000 to 90,000. The precise amount is practically irrelevant at this time, although the truth is most likely somewhere in that range. It's important to comprehend the violent frenzy that the quota system caused. Scenes of utter horror are described by modern chroniclers. Soldiers have broken into houses and taken whole families with them. People are attempting to hide anywhere they can get away, such as in crypts, wells, and attics. The heaps of bodies are making it impossible to navigate the streets. This is when it becomes even more unsettling, if that's even possible. This time, troops began murdering their own prisoners since the quota was so stringent and the dread of not meeting it was so great. To make ends meet, they may have sold valuable slaves. According to some accounts, soldiers killed their own wives in order to satisfy the criterion if they couldn't find enough victims in the city. That final detail may be propaganda or exaggeration, but the fact that chroniclers thought it plausible speaks something about the mood Tamerlane fostered that we're still talking about dozens of these monuments to mass mortality, even if that figure is inflated. Again, medieval chroniclers did embellish. The towers were located in public squares near city entrances at significant crossroads. They all stood in for hundreds or thousands of people who had only been alive a few days before. It must have been an intolerable stench. Anyone who saw it was left with lifelong scars. Tamerlane also gave the order to demolish Baghdad's magnificent public structures. Libraries containing valuable manuscripts were set on fire. Palaces were demolished. One of the greatest cities in history had its physical infrastructure methodically destroyed. It's interesting to note that he spared the shrines, mosques, and places of worship. This was not done out of deference. It was a tactic. He wanted the world to understand that he was not fighting Islam. He was fighting disobedience. The religious structures emphasized the idea that God's houses remain by standing as solitary monuments among a sea of ruins. Everything else is lost. Like Delhi before it, Baghdad was reduced to a hollow shell of its former self. The surviving ran away. The economy fell apart. The cultural heritage was destroyed. For years, the skull towers served as a warning to anyone else who would think about disobeying Tamerlane. That's it. Tamerlane's name became synonymous with cruelty after 5 deliberate acts of terror. He performed rather than merely conquered, from the skull towers of Baghdad to the buried troops of Sivas. Each massacre served as a lesson. Every crime was a tactic. He had an understanding that the majority of conquerors lacked. Your reputation has the power to defend you. If you can make people sufficiently afraid, they will give up before you ever get there. He made fear a useful tool for the military. And it was successful. He established an empire that stretched from Russia to the Persian Gulf and from Turkey to India. The problem with civilizations based on terror, though, is this. They are fleeting. Just 7 years after sacking Delhi while preparing an invasion of China, Tamerlane passed away in 1405. His dominion broke up in a matter of decades. His offspring engaged in combat with one another. The regions divided. However, his remembrance persisted for centuries, and his name is still called. The stories endured despite the collapse of the skull towers. And that's probably the scariest aspect of it all. Tamerlane achieved his goal of immortality. Now, 620 years after his passing, we are discussing him. He continues to prevail. Which act, in your opinion, was the most terrifying? The deliberate brutality of burying men alive at Sivas, the catastrophic sack of Delhi, the quota system of Baghdad, the skull towers of Isfahan, or the total rubber of Urgench? Tell me which one most bothered you in the comments. You're obviously in the darkest recesses of history if you've made it this far. Every week, we discuss this kind of material, the creatures that truly existed, the harsh realities of human nature, and the tales you are not taught in school. To ensure you don't miss the next one, click the subscribe button and enable notifications. Thank you for viewing, and keep in mind that the most terrifying creatures are the ones that have survived.